Alright, yo people, today we're gonna be diving into something interesting. Two of my favorite topics coming together. That's books and that's hustling, innit? So today I'm gonna be talking about 50 Cent, aka Curtis Jackson's book, Hustle Harder and Hustle Smarter. Yeah? You see that? 50 Cent, Curtis Jackson, Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter, innit? So this video is actually going to be a two-tone video. I'm not going to dive too deep into why I think people should read books, but this book will be a perfect example of why people should start reading books, especially those who don't read and they think that reading's a bit pointless. Cool. If you're anything like me, when I first heard about this book, I naively would have thought, what is 50 Cent put in a book that could be beneficial to my life? You know what I'm saying? Me and him live two different kind of lives. When I actually first listened to this, it was on Audible, narrated by him, which is quite interesting, so I checked that out. And I was thinking, there's nothing really in it for me. But then the book was called Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter. And I pride myself on being a hustler. And I'm also trying to make a milli. And he's a multi-millionaire, so of course there was gems in there. So I picked up the book, and I'd actually say I've read quite a lot of books from loads of different artists, hundreds of years ago, modern day, 21st century, and I said I'd comfortably put this book in my top 5 to 10 of books. Like, it's a perfect kind of book. It's like the 21st century hustlers think and grow rich. Like, young black hustlers, this should be their think and grow rich. It's a great book, and you know, I'm just gonna go get into it, you know what I'm saying? Alright, cool. So 50 actually starts the book talking about he himself growing up. He didn't really read too much. Like, it wasn't a thing in his environment, and it just wasn't a thing that people like him and in his area did a lot. Like, they weren't really into reading. So he said the way he actually started reading was reading in authors who spoke in a familiar way to him. People such as Iceberg Slim, etc., etc. And then he said when he got more into that and read more books, he started reading more people like Paulo Coelho, the person who wrote The Alchemist, and Robert Greene, who he, interestingly enough, actually co-authored a book with called The 50th Law. I've also listened to that as well, so I might do another review on that or a summary of that. And that's actually quite a good book as well. So he said when he started reading those books, started reading more, and then he realized the power of reading in it. And what I say with this book and why it's so perfect is because 50 actually speaks, his flow and the way he writes is actually very casual and it's very informal. So for those people who don't really read a lot, or they think, oh, I don't really get books, it's kind of a perfect start because he speaks in quite a manner that is easy for people to understand. But it's also not so informal that if you're like an avid reader, you might be thinking, oh, I can't really deal with this. It's actually quite a perfect writing style. If you can understand what I'm saying with my bits of slang here and there, you definitely understand what he's going into. So cool. So the book is very, very insightful. As a young black person as well, it's kind of always helpful to see how someone navigates different industries and different egos. But he says there's actually a lot of similarities between when he was hustling, selling drugs in New York, and when he's doing the business meetings up with all these tycoons. So obviously, if for some reason you don't know 50 Cent or you're not too up to date with what he's done, obviously in the 2000s, he was a very popular hip hop artist. He came out with his debut album, Get Rich or Die Trying. He also made a movie about that, so he acted in that. And then currently, more to date, he's not a musician, so to speak, I believe right now, but he's the producer and stars in on the TV show Power, which is very popular on Stars TV. And then he talks about that in the big book, how he negotiated and how he started. And it wasn't a pop, it wasn't a hit, and he didn't get paid a lot when he started it. He actually had to start with a lower advance for him, and he had to build it. He's also one of these big business deals that he negotiated, which is quite smart. I mentioned in one of the chapters, Know Your Value, is his deal with glacial water, I don't know, Vitamin 50, the mineral water, which actually sold to Coca-Cola for 4.1 billion, and he had an equity stake in that, which is part of his key negotiation skills he talks about in the chapter. So that and things with effing vodka, and you may know he's very active on Instagram. He's kind of like a king of marketing. So the Curtis Jackson is more the business side today, but 50 Cent, he talks about the up and coming and how he managed that and the lessons he learned from when he was hustling in Queens, New York, and how the drug game, he says, is not quite too different from the business atmosphere now. So he talks about that, his divide, his growing up, his upbringing. He lost his mother quite young when he was around 9-10 years old. So he talks about all of that and how he balances it. Cool. So the first chapter is actually about, he calls it Finding Fearlessness. So in this story, he basically talks about when he was young, up and coming. Obviously, as I mentioned, he lost his mother quite young. So he said something like that is literally most people's biggest fear. losing their parent, especially when they're young. So he said once he went through that, he kind of like, there was nothing really left for him to fear. So he tells a story about how he was going to a gym and he was like learning how to box, and that kind of helped with his mindset of not being scared to get hit. So he talks about don't be scared to get hit and don't be scared to fall over. You got to lean into fear. He says every time you experience fear, it's an opportunity to take action. So that's what he talks about. So I found out that what he said there, I don't know if that's what I learned it, but that's actually quite facts. In my own life, I realized that the best cure for fear in anything you do, whether it's starting a business, whether it's talking to someone or taking a business opportunity, is action. Because when you're scared or when you're fearful, it's the anticipation, it's the anxiety of thinking, oh, should I do it? Should I not? Should I do it? Should I not? Once you do it, like you're doing it, you're in there. You can't be scared anymore. You've taken action. So I say also, action is the greatest cure for fear. So he talks about that a lot in the chapter. Obviously, if you're not aware, one of the biggest things that makes 50 Cent famous as a rapper was he actually got shot 9 times. So he got shot 9 times, he almost died. Like, that's a big part of his story. So obviously he talks about the story of that and how he recovered from that, because obviously once you've been shot and people are trying to kill you, that's quite a big thing. So he talks about how he had to get his fitness up because he still wanted to be a boxer. So what he actually tells the story about is how he was rolling around with his friend. He kept a pistol with him, and his friend cycled behind him to keep him guard so he could like get into it. He said initially like he was shit scared, like he didn't want to leave his house, like he didn't want to go out. Imagine someone just tried to kill you and they're still about. He was mad scared, he didn't want to leave the house, but he said, right, he can't live in fear and stay at home. That's not the kind of person he is. So he said he had to take the best measures he could. Obviously, I'm not advising, it's not a positive thing to be rolling around with a gun, but that's just the situation he was in life, and he chose to take the fearless option of going out, taking precautions, having someone with him, having his own form of protection. Luckily, nothing ever happened, but that is his idea of being fearless. Like, even though he was scared, and he admits, he says in the book he was scared, people tried to kill him, he doesn't want to die. He took his own measures. He didn't allow the fear to paralyze him and cause him to take inaction and not work on his own goals and let him live his life. So he moved about that. So that's kind of what the first chapter is about. Cool. Another one of the chapters 50 talks about is Heart of a Hustler, innit? This is quite close to my heart, and I really like reading this because it's always great and insightful to see that successful people do talk about and acknowledge the luck in their journey, but they also talk about how hard they are. In this book, 50 says, even once he's become successful, he is the kind of person that is willing to hustle harder than 99% of the population. He talks about he's always working out, he doesn't stop. Like, he says sometimes he's stayed in the studio till 3 a.m. in the night, and he's told his driver to come get him 5 in the morning for him to get his workout. So he's saying he's always willing to work, he's always serious about it, and he believes hustling. He said he's not the smartest person in the room. He says he was not even the best rapper, he isn't even the most lyrical or the most lyrically talented. He admits that, he says in the book. He says Biggie and Pac were better than all these kinds of things. But he says the reason he's so popular, the reason he got to where he was, because he's willing to outwork people. I don't know if I read this in a book, but he talks about a time where he went to like an artist retreat boot camp, and a lot of the rappers there were just kind of like messing about, taking pictures or just smoking and just enjoying. But he said he went there and he wrote like 2 projects in a week, and like he went hard, like he hustled hard. So one of the biggest points in the obviously called Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter, he's talking about having the heart of a hustler. Like, you can't control the innate abilities you've been bestowed upon in life. You can't control the situation you'll be born into or what's around you, but what you can do is work hard. Like, people don't like to hear this, but hard work does pay off. Like, you can't, even if you're not the smartest person, if you work hard and you put yourself to something and you work hard and you're consistent and you turn up every day, you will see the results. So that's one of the key chapters in this book about how important hard work is. And obviously it's just a good lesson to understand. This is someone who's successful. And a lot of people like to say this thing like, oh, it's easy for rich people, successful people to say, but it's a key thing, it's a true thing. Like, the most successful and wealthiest people are the people who work the hardest to get where they are, and once they're there, they don't stop. He talks about he's still like this, he's non-stop, he's always working. So that's a habit I'm trying to cultivate in my daily life. Always be working hard, no days off, and just stay on it. Do you know what I'm saying? Hustle hard. Cool. So my favorite chapter in this book is the one where he talks about knowing your value. So he said it'd be beautiful if like everybody, you know what I mean, every time you negotiated with someone, every time you spoke with someone, they always gave you exactly what you're worth. But he said that's not really how it works in life and in business. And he says, oh cool, he's 50 Cent, he's always like, give me the loot, give me the loot. People would think he's like a hard and fast negotiator. But he said Curtis Jackson's nothing like that. He said he's actually a really, really patient negotiator, and that's been one of the reasons why he's been so successful in his business endeavors. So the examples he gives in this chapter is number one with power, number two is he's vitamin water with a glacio. I still don't know how to say that. And then yeah, so basically he talks about with power that when he was pitching power, he had big dreams from. He wrote this book in like 2015 or something. I can't even remember. But he said when he wrote Power and pitched Power, he had ideas for it to be like a big multiverse, like kind of like Marvel. But obviously he had to get through the first series, so he took like about, he said, like 10K an episode. And obviously he's 50 Cent. He's saying he could go to a club for like 10 minutes and make 50K. Like, so 10K an episode for him is undervalued. But because he had the vision and he knew and he believed that his vision was going to be so big, he didn't mind taking a pay cut. And after the first season, which if you do know the show is very successful, he's now expanded. And today in 2021, I've seen that they're doing spin-offs for all the characters. So his vision is actually manifesting live right now because he was willing to take a pay cut because he believed in his vision. So cool. The thing he did with Glacier Water is actually really smart, and I really want to talk about it because it's one of his most successful business moves as well. So he said he figured out, he saw this mineral water and he thought it was really cool, and he's like, ah, cool. So what he did is he did an ad or commercial, and then he flashed it for like a quick second. And obviously he's quite famous, so when they did that, they got in touch with his manager and they wanted to do a promotional campaign with him. And then they wanted to pay him like a fixed fee, like one time. But he said, nah, do you know what? Like, I really like this company. I really like this business. I want to get equity. And they were like, like 50 Cent, like a rapper, like, why do you want to give him this kind of equity? But he believed in the vision and told, like, he came, like, he only came with his manager, didn't come with no entourage, came, negotiated. He said it was a long negotiate and he had to be very patient, but he ended up negotiating an equity stake in the company. And then that worked out because, as I said, Coca-Cola ended up buying that company for 4.1 billion. He says in the book he literally cannot disclose how much he got because he signed an NDA, but he said it's one of the biggest paydays he ever received in his life. So he said him being patient and taking that equity stake as opposed to a big payoff was one of the best decisions. And then this is what I like about the book so much, because he talks about a different story where he had some guy he was working with in the studio, and this was before he blew. So before his first album took off, they were recording like his house, like a basement. And they were just doing it like as friends. But once he got signed to a label, he said his friend sent him an invoice for 50K. And he was like, wow, like I didn't think it was that. But what he told his friend is, if you feel like you're entitled to that reimbursement, that's cool, but I'll give you 30,000 and I'll give you a point. And a point is basically like a percentage of a project. So you get a percentage, 1 point is usually 1%, I believe, of how well the project does. So he said, I'll give you 30,000 a point. And the guy said, no. I want my 50K. I want my 50 large. And he said the guy's lawyer even said, yo, are you crazy? Take the point. I'll give you 20K for it. He said, nah. I want the 50K. Like, he wanted what he believed he was worth. So 50 gave him the 50. 2,500. Yeah, 50 gave him the 50. And then, obviously, he said that point that he declined ended up being worth 1.2 million. So imagine that. He was talking about people who understand, like, when to like put your ego aside and maybe pick a different option. He also talks about when he got signed with Eminem, but obviously there's so much in the book and in all of his chapters, he gives these good stories about his own life experiences. Then people he knows, like people at Jason, he talks about Diddy, all these other kind of people, and applies it. So it's honestly just a really good book, all in all. The last chapter I really want to talk about in this book is the one about, he calls it Evolve or Die. So this chapter is actually quite smart, and it's something really insightful that you'd want to see from a rapper writing it. So it's Evolve or Die. So he said he went on a world tour and he was performing, and like the world tour was going crazy, it was going amazing. But when he came back to the US, his hometown, like people weren't showing him the love anymore. They were starting to think, what's going on? Is the way I'm performing it? Is it the song? And he said, nah, like I've just went international and it was great. And he said he started to realize like he was coming to the end of his shelf life as a rapper. Like rapping is inherently like a young person's game. Whoever's the new and most damaged is what he says. So he's starting to realize, I'm getting old. So this is when he started to think, okay, what can he do? He said at this point, instead of being like trying to force it or push his way through, he decided to evolve. So what he started doing, he said he was writing and he was working really hard on his songs, but instead of releasing it, he'd ghostwrite and give it to another rapper. And obviously, as you've seen, he's segued into the TV show industry. He's doing really successful with that, with Power. And then obviously he started getting more into business. So he said one of the most important things in life is knowing when to move, when to evolve, when to change. Because if you don't, you're going to die, you're going to fade away. And obviously this is a perfect example of a very just in general life lesson. Another book that's really good in this is Dr. Spencer R. Johnson of Who Moved My Cheese. That's another key book about knowing when to change, knowing when to evolve, knowing when to move. Like, you can't stay stagnant with what you're doing. One way I've applied this kind of evolve or die principle in my own life is I used to be very active on social media. Like, I used to use it like every other person. I was on Twitter. And I built quite a following on Twitter. And I was like, oh, wow, I'm building a following. I leverage it in different ways, like benefit my own life. But it was nothing ever, you know what I'm saying, anything. So I was like, but I can't just tweeting like all my life. So I was like, how am I gonna leverage this? Like, I clearly got some kind of voice. How can I use it? So here I am on the camera. I've evolved, you know what I'm saying? Because evolve or die. Internet has become a very different place in general in the last couple of years. So you got to create your own platform and create your own community and distribute it. So you got to evolve or die. That's how I see it. So I'm saying this is how I'm using it in my own life. So look, I don't want to tell you all about the whole book in it. So I've just given my 2 pence on it. I feel like it's a very good book. As I said, it's definitely in my top 5 to 10 books. And it's very essential if you're, you know what I mean, if you're trying to make a milli, you got to be a hustler. And this is straight from the horse's mouth of one of the most successful people in the world to say. He's done the music, he's done the business. So I say, therefore, check it out. You know what I mean? To recap, the chapter I talk about is finding fearlessness, the importance of being fearless in the world and using fear as an opportunity to take action. Another one of the chapters we talk about was Heart of a Hustler. That's just basically on working hard, on waking up early, putting in the hours and putting in the hours on your grind, working on it, focus on it and outworking people. Like, you can't always be the smartest, you can't always be the most athletically gifted, but you can always outwork people because that's always in your hands. And obviously, the importance of knowing your value. So this chapter was like a really good chapter in terms of business and negotiation and just going around. He talked about the importance of apprenticeships, which I didn't really touch on. But yeah, knowing your value with deals, business, relationship is very important. I really recommend that chapter on like just the business sense of it. It was a really good chapter. And it's just not always taking the payday is the biggest hit home in that chapter. Even for someone that's so like big on money, 50 Cent, he said not always taking the payday and looking about the bigger opportunity, who you might be working with, the people, is what he kind of emphasized in that chapter. The last chapter I talked about was Evolve or Die. That's like when 50 talks about knowing when the end of his career as a rapper was kind of coming and how he shifted and maneuvered to make himself still relevant in today's society, still like a bigger factor. He said his audience was growing up. They weren't in clubs anymore. They weren't really listening to music like they were now at home and they had all these issues. So that's why he made Power. He said that resonated with his audience more as they grew up. So him evolving was one of the most important career decisions and what made him successful till today. So that was really important. There's other chapters, I only touched on about half of them and I only scratched the surface. If you found anything value in it, I would really recommend the book. It's a great book. Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter, Curse Jackson, aka 50 Cent. Great book, I recommend it. Check it out, man. Stay hard, hustle hard, and on the journey to get this million. Let's go, man.